Hey, what's up, Stringlings? I want to bring you up to speed on something that I mentioned in another video, neoclassical music. Let's talk about this. So in a previous video, actually one of my reviews, I mentioned that there's a section in Master of Puppets that sounds romantic, okay? And it was actually a big boomy section, and people thought that was a little weird. Why is that romantic? It doesn't sound romantic. I was talking about romantic in terms of the musical time period. We'll talk about that in an upcoming video as well. But I also mentioned that the structure of the composition was very neoclassical. And that struck a chord with some people because I did point out, I said not neoclassical in the Yngwie Malmsteen sense, but neoclassical in the 20th century Stravinsky Prokofiev sense. And that can be a little bit confusing because it's also an architectural style. So I just want to help define this a little bit for you. Neo is not just a hero from the Matrix. Neo is a prefix that we use to describe a revival. It literally means new. Okay? And when you have something that's new or a revival, it's hearkening back to an older version of something. It's trying to revive that thing. And in the art world of Western civilization, there was a period around the end of the 1600s into the 1700s when artists and architects were trying to revive, because of the explosion of the scientific revolution. There was a lot of interest in the science and mathematics of ancient Greece and Rome. And that interest sparked a whole stylistic revolution that was known as the Neoclassical Movement. My cat just walked in. Known as the Neoclassical Movement. So the Neoclassical style in art and architecture was defined by symmetry, straight lines, columns, and a lot of themes based around classical Greek and Roman mythology. So at the time, this was referred to as neoclassicism, or neoclassical art and architecture, and it impacted the world of music in a way that musicians began trying to reflect those structures in their compositions. We're talking about Mozart and Haydn at this point. And in so doing, we now refer to that period in music as the classical period, even though the art period is neoclassical. That's where it gets a little bit confusing. Hi, come on up. Come on up. She's camera shy today. So that's where it gets a little bit confusing, because what ends up happening is at the end of the Romantic era, the end of the 1800s, music tonality started breaking down, and we started exploring a lot of dissonant structures in music. And then, as a reaction to that, a Russian fellow by the name of Prokofiev composed a symphony that is now popularly referred to as his classical symphony. It's very out of place in contemporary 20th century music of that time. Okay, just super important to note that. It was new because it was old. There's Bailey. Okay, because it was an older style, it used major and minor keys, it used a formal structure that was based around those keys. Used a formal structure that was based around those keys. We refer to it now as his classical symphony. That wasn't necessarily his intent. And we find that the next guy on the block was Igor Stravinsky, a man who composed a lot of very intense ballet scores throughout the 1920s, but he also went through a period of what we now call his neoclassical period. So, whereas neoclassicism in the 17th and 18th centuries was a revival of classical Greek and Roman styles of design, neoclassicism in the 20th century was a revival of the musical style of the 18th century, or an attempt to modernize the musical style of the 18th century. This is different from neoclassical rock. Now, neoclassical rock burst onto the scene in the early 80s with a guy named Yngwie Malmsteen. Now, there is some debate in that earlier acts, like Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, for example, had a lot of elements of what we would consider neoclassical rock. But I think generally it's conceded that Yngwie is the guy who really lit a spark under neoclassicism. Okay, and I have a little bit of an issue with calling it neoclassical rock. I think that the term classical, as it's being applied here, is like the genre of classical music. When music historians talk about neoclassical music, they're talking about music that's attempting to revive specifically the classical period in music, so the 1700s. When rock historians talk about neoclassical rock, they're talking about drawing in elements of all of what we call small c classical music, which I talked about in the last video. So I think that's the difference, because when you do an analysis of the music of Yngwie, for example, he does say that he was heavily influenced by Paganini and Bach. Okay, now Paganini and Bach lived in two very different musical time periods and performed in two very different musical styles. The reality is, from my perspective as a musicologist, I look at it and I say, actually, what I'm hearing is more like Tartini than Paganini, because what makes Yngwie sound like Yngwie isn't the shredding, it's the harmonic structures. And the harmonic structures he uses are very much based on the style of the Baroque period. If we want to be really, really pedantic about it, Yngwie's style is Neo-Rococo. If we want to be really pedantic about it, okay? But the elements that Yngwie is bringing in that we would consider classical-ish are a little bit specific to the Baroque period, right? We're looking at common practice harmony, all right? It's not all just 1/4s and 5s like rock music tends to be, 1/6/4/5 or 1/2/6/5. Sorry, 1/6/2/5. That kind of thing. It's specific, like sequences that roll through entire cycles of harmony. Sequences are another big one. So a sequence is the same pattern of notes, the same pattern of notes shifting down intervals or up intervals. It's resolving diminished sevenths. This isn't a thing that what we would call standard American rock does. And it's pedal point repeated notes, right? And you can hear these things a lot in the music of Yngwie Malmsteen. It's defined as a style by speed, scales, sequences, lots of arpeggios, and that particular sound palette that also includes things like organs and keyboards and harpsichords, things that... Okay, I didn't want to keep that couch anyway. Things that are commonly associated with music of the 18th century. So it's a look, it's a style, it's a sound, but it isn't classical in the sense of drawing from the music of Mozart. It's classical in the sense of drawing from the sounds of things that we associate with Western art music. From that perspective, we could argue, and I have argued before, and I will probably argue again, the big three of vintage heavy metal, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and Black Sabbath, represent three elements of ancient Western classical music. Led Zeppelin has a very Renaissance feel to a lot of their music. Black Sabbath has a very medieval feeling to a lot of their music. And there's a cat on my lap. And Deep Purple has a very Baroque feel. You can actually draw direct correlations between the music of Ritchie Blackmore and the music of Vivaldi. So anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is when we refer to neoclassical music, we can be referring to neoclassical rock, which covers basically a revival of anything from the broad genre of classical music, or we can be referring to, sorry about the noise there, stop, go. We can be referring to, we're going to talk about neoclassical rock, anything in the broad genre of classical music, or neoclassicism in the 20th century sense with the music of Stravinsky and Prokofiev, trying to revive specifically the music of the 18th century. So I hope that kind of clears it up a little bit. If it doesn't, please ask questions in the comments. I am more than happy to go back over this because I love nothing more than the sound of my own voice prattling on for 10 minutes about musical minutia that really I'm probably the only one on this channel who cares about. But you know, it's fun. I'm not teaching a lot these days, so I like getting this stuff off my chest. So if you liked it, leave a comment. If you have questions, leave a question. If you're not subscribed, please do. And if you care to support the channel, take a swing by my Patreon, and I will be more than happy to accept your donations. That's incredibly cheesy, but you know, what can I say? These are the things that keep the channel rolling, all right? So I hope you enjoyed that, and have yourselves a great day, and we'll be back again soon.